In this video lecture, you should learn the following things. Where is China located? How big is it relative to the U.S. and what were its main rivers? What great building projects were part of China's past and are still part of China's present? How did early China view itself and the world around it? What type of government did early China have? And what was the first dynasty? How did warlord government operate? What human and animal sacrifices were part of Shang culture? What classes existed in Shang society and what traditions were established already by 1600 BC? What was Tian? How did the Shang lose control over China? And what dynasty took over next? What was Tianming? How did it operate? And how did it make every future king's life more difficult? Ancient China was comparable to New Kingdom Egypt. Shang China and New Kingdom Egypt were contemporaries of each other. They existed at the same moment in history. And there are similarities between the two early cultures, that of early Egypt and that of early China. China's modern population is over 1.4 billion. And just recently, the government has okayed and authorized families that once were limited to two children now can have 3. And we'll see how large families, when and where that became such a standard tradition within China's culture. Modern China has been busy sending space probes to the moon and Mars, and China is in competition with Japan to see which country can develop the moon. China is interested in developing it for commercial mining, and Japan is interested in developing it for tourism. Early China, its people were clearing forests for farming at 10,000 BC, and it had well-established cities by 2000 BC. It is one of 4 places on Earth that turned to farming before the great climate change that caused everyone to turn to farming. It is an easternmost Asian country. It shares the peninsula with Vietnam, Korea, Mongolia, Russia, India to its west. And geographically, it had 3 main river systems with offshoot rivers. But in the extreme north, the Huanghe River, often called the Yellow River, because yearly flooding that destroyed the villages around the river also brought down a rich yellow-based soil with the floods that enriched the soil. In the middle of the country, the Yangtze River of central China, and in the southern part of China, the Xi River. And China has a history of great building projects. The Great Wall Project is one such building project from its past. It was begun in the 200s BC by the Qin dynasty, and that's spelled Qin but pronounced Qin. And it was continued by the dynasty that followed it, the 4th dynasty, the Han dynasty. When the initial construction was complete, it was originally 2,600 miles long, and then later upgrades took it to 3,100 miles long and finally to 3,700 miles long. It is an artificial barrier across China's northern border to keep out some political enemies that began to invade the country. Here's China's modern Great Wall, or the equivalent of it. It is called the Sanxia Project, or alternately the Three Rivers Gorges Project. It was built on the Yangtze River, the middle central river, as China tries to move away from coal power to hydroelectric power. The floodplain created by this dam is 400 miles long and 300 feet deep. 1 million people had to be relocated out of 116 towns and 2 cities. And the floodplain is so large and so deep that the weight of it caused the Earth to slow down 1 second in its orbital speed. The Sanxia project has walls that are 574 feet high, and when this dam goes to full power in the summer of 2022, It will put out the equivalent of 26 medium-sized nuclear reactors. China is slightly larger than the United States physically. We have 328 million people, while China has over 1.4 billion. Our first colonial government began in 1619 AD with Virginia, and China's first government began in 1600 BC, and it existed during the time of Egypt's New Kingdom. Like early Egypt, early China was a very ethnocentric nation, which means you believe that outside peoples and cultures are inferior. It had a peculiar relationship with the outside world and other countries in Asia. For early China, the four cardinal directions were not just east, west, north, and south, but Eastern barbarian, Northern barbarian, Western barbarian, Southern barbarian. And when a culture uses barbarian, and there's a difference between barbarian and savage, we tend to use them interchangeably, but they're not. Savage means we are saying you have no culture whatsoever, but when we use the term barbarian, it means you have a culture, but it's inferior. So early China had a relationship with early Korea, which went by the name of the Kingdom of Pai Chi. And it also had a relationship with early Japan, which it called the Land of Hua. So China was often the source of new ideas or new technology that were spread out of the core of China. And so if another country was going to transmit something that China had invented or innovated, it was usually transmitted out of the Asian mainland by Korea, this Kingdom of Pai Chi. And originally, the relationship between China and Korea was so strong that the Chinese emperors always personally crowned the kings of Pai Chi before they could become king. They had to be crowned by the Chinese emperor. Usually, ideas from the outside world are transmitted from Japan, Land of Hua, into Korea and then into China. So there is a relationship between China and its surrounding countries. Dynastic feudalism was the early political power of China, and some of the early dynasties were the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, and the Han. And if I haven't mentioned this before, in World Civ, almost nothing is pronounced the way it looks like it should be. Clans are more important than any individual member, and so the clan name came first, the individual name came second. So I would be Morris Michael. What would your name be reversed in the normal Chinese fashion? Warlord families were the most powerful rulers of China, and the most powerful of these families ruled the early country. But here's the problem. Even the most powerful warlord family needed some extra or auxiliary troops, leased from these other warlord families. And so the ruling family always borrowed soldiers from these other families in exchange, giving them land, giving the other family land. And this political arrangement is called feudalism. If it sounds very familiar, we study it quite a lot when it happens in Europe in the time of kings and knights. This feudal arrangement, dynastic feudalism, encourages the other warlord families, giving them the hope that one day they will get to take over. After all, the ruling family needs their borrowed soldiers to maintain power, so why not them? Why not this other warlord family being able to take over one day? The Shang ruled from the city of Anyang on the Huanghe River. Anyang had underground burial chambers for their Shang kings and their queens. That's right, we have specialized buildings for the burial chambers, and just like Egyptian queens, Chinese queens were entombed with their husbands. It means if they were still alive, they took a painless poison so they could go into the afterlife with the husband. It's very good to keep the husband alive as long as possible. Because the king would need guarding in the afterlife, soldiers and their horses were brought into the burial chamber and put to death next to the ruler so they could guard him in the afterlife. The Shang also executed common people and buried them in the foundations of new public buildings, which was done for good luck. In cultures where food is scarce and the population is large, and that is the scenario that fits early China, the executions of people for, let's say, trivial reasons will be fairly common. Here are some of the human and horse skeletons found in the foundations of some of Shang buildings. People were taught it was an honor to go into the tombs into the afterlife, to be buried with the king, to serve him, and this includes his favorite servants who were also put to death and put in there to serve him in the afterlife. Here's another look at some of the archaeology digs done in and around Anyang. You see that the foundations went into the earth quite a ways. Shang society was stratified, meaning it had classes and layers, and the opposite of stratified society is egalitarian, one where people are basically equal to each other, and that is not the case for early Shang China. The king and the royal family were at the top of society, and kings often claimed to have descended from the gods or from great war heroes. China's word for the afterlife was Tian, or the heaven, and it means the heavens. Next came priests, scribes, and generals who made up sort of a middle layer of society, but we cannot say middle class. You can only use the term middle class after you've had industrialization and factories, because that is what created a true middle class. Priests and scribes were powerful people because they knew how to read and write. We'll talk a little bit more about the priests in a moment. And generals were the most trusted people that kings could rely upon to maintain order. Where we would have fit in, where about 90% of China's society fell, was into the peasant farmer class of people. The ones doing all the work, growing all the food. Shang kings were expansionistic. The other warlords who loaned them soldiers were their vassals. So when the king takes soldiers from another warlord family, that warlord family becomes his vassal. The Shang drained the warlord families of their soldiers, as the Shang were constantly at war, expanding and taking over new valleys, new towns, new regions. They also drained the peasant farmers in taxes paid in food. The Shang needed money to maintain war, and they needed food to expand the army so that it could keep conquering. Shang kings put pressure on their priests or shamans, and when we use the word priest in the ancient world, yes, this is a religious specialist, but it's not like a Catholic or an Anglican priest. These priests were expected to be able to cure people. They were expected to predict the future. Especially Shang kings wanted their priests to be able to tell the future, because after all, the king wanted to know if he was going to win in battle the next day, or, just as important, when he was going to have a son to pass everything down to. Chinese priests carved the king's questions, whatever they were, into bones, and then put those bones in the fire till the bones cracked. Well, this is a form of fortune-telling called scapulomancy, and you can probably notice the reference to the scapula, a bone in your shoulder. The cracks that resulted in the bone being heated were the answers from the heavens sent back to the king and interpreted by the priests. If the bone looks familiar, if it looks like a turtle shell to you, that's because it really was. So these were called oracle bones in China, and when I ask you about this on a test question, I want the term oracle bone, not turtle shell fortune telling. So over time, the cracks were pulled into China's language as new characters in the Chinese language. And by the way, did I mention it's a language of 10,000 characters? Compare that to your 26 letters in the basic English alphabet. But don't worry, modern Chinese say you don't need to know all 10,000 characters. 5,000 is more than enough to be accepted as a polished, literate person. Here are a few words from the Shang dynasty and how they've changed over time. So up top, you see the character that represented an ox or a goat or a tree, the way it was spelled in the time of the Shang, 1600 BC, and then how that character has changed over time. Some of them are quite different, as you notice. There were many traditions in place by the time of the Shang dynasty. Society was already very ethnocentric and viewed the outside world as inferior, and we've already talked about the 4 cardinal directions. It was also a very order-conscious society. Clans were more important than the individual members, so the clan name came first, personal name came second. For example, one of the Shang kings beloved by his people was Shang Wuding. So Shang is his clan name, Wuding is his personal name. In that order-conscious society, every class had its place, and it was best if you knew your place in society. The Chinese believed that Tian, the heavens, picked the ruling family and kept them in place. So who was an ordinary person to go against the rule of the king? The priests interpreted the will of the heavens, and everyone's deceased family members went into the heavens. Even the deceased of poor families believed that their departed person, once on the other side, could help the living family, let's say just by sending rain or by sending a lot of children. Here are some of the established orders that were accepted as the norm in Shang China. Adults outranked and were more important than children. Men outranked and were more important than women. And when it comes to China and the family, China always had a large population, and the food supply was not always able to keep pace with the food supply. There were shortages, there were famines. The early Chinese often only had enough food for either a choice between feeding their family or feeding their livestock. Most made a choice to invest in large families. They chose families, but often used their children to pull the plow because they couldn't afford the ox. And large families became the norm in early China. So a large family, especially if there are a lot of sons, were a sign of being blessed by the heavens or Tian. And maybe that was something that your grandpa helped arrange when he crossed over to the other side. Over time, the Shang pushed the other warlord families, so they would be the Qin, the Zhou, the Han, the Qi, the Wei. They absolutely pushed them to their limits by draining soldiers. And the Shang also drained the ordinary farmers of all but the most basic subsistent food. Shang Di turned out to be the last ruling king of this dynasty, and he was on the throne in 1075 BC. He was a giant of a man, around 6'6", in a country where the average man's height was about 5'5". And if you remember your fairy tale stories from childhood, giants don't make out too well, do they? They often come crashing down. So what we're saying is, and this is part of human nature, his own people were afraid of him and whispered about him behind his back because he was so much taller than the rest of them. He had certain personal behaviors that made them whisper and talk as well. He took battle souvenirs from the battlefield in the form of human skulls. And if that's not bad enough, he closed up the openings in that skull, had a hole bored in the top, put a handle on the side, and made it a drinking cup. And he had a whole wall of these human skull drinking cups that he collected. Well, that made people very uneasy about him as well. He also loved to have his enemies tortured to death in front of him while he drank alcoholic drinks. And he would have them burned to death by having them held against a terracotta or clay cylinder full of coals that were burning. So if you imagine a very small miniature chimney, round chimney, and someone being pulled around it with their arms pulled around each side of the chimney and held there, being burned alive while the emperor watched. In 1027, both the demands of the Shang and these personal characteristics of Shang Di pushed the warlord families and the peasant farmers too far. In something that almost never happens in human history, the very wealthy at the top and the very poor at the bottom teamed up and drove this family from power in a political revolution. It gave the other warlord families a chance to seize power, and when the dust cleared, a new family, the Zhou, were in charge of early China. And the first thing they did was send the Shang survivors out to the outskirts of China and put them in charge of the most far-reaching, out in the middle of nowhere outpost. They got rid of them, but they didn't kill the survivors. They just put them out to the far edges of the country. The Zhou tried from the start to rule differently and to some extent more humanely. But doubt and anxiety crept into society because of the revolution. Remember, this had happened in Egypt too after a revolution. When order is restored, the people still cannot calm down. They are very anxious about what's happened. The revolution had removed the Shang, but the people had always been taught that the heavens, Tian, control this. So if the heavens really control everything, how are the people allowed to remove the rulers? And so this is like pulling a thread in a piece of fabric. If we were taught this about the gods pick the king, but we were allowed to overthrow the king, it imposes the question, is everything else we've taught a lie? Is everything that we believe a lie? So the priests went to work to answer the question of how the ordinary people were allowed to drive the Shang out of power. And what the priests came up with was Tianming, a political philosophy. The literal meaning of Tianming is glorious heavens. Ming means glorious. And the philosophy says that the heavens do pick the ruler, but they will allow him to be driven out of power if he displeases the heavens. He must fight to stop all social change. That might be one thing that he doesn't do well that might get him driven from power. He must make sure that land is never taken from the great families. And he must make sure that all of the elderly are respected. So if he doesn't do these things, there will be warning signs that he is about to be driven from power. The first signs that the heavens will send are earthquakes, famine, and flood. Oh boy, the king's job has just gotten a lot more difficult. China is prone to earthquakes, and it was prone to famine, and it is prone to flood from rivers like that northern river, the Huanghe. So Zhou Wen is the first new king. So remember, Zhou is his clan name, Wen is his personal name. One of the ways that he tried to work to earn Tianming was he distributed grain in times of famine, because he did not want the people going into a war or a revolution just on the basis of one sign. So according to Tianming, there is a second set of signs, and if these follow the first, it's a clear signal to the people that they can rise up. So some of these secondary warning signs would be comets and meteors and eclipses. Well, you know, human beings have no control over these things. There are comets that appear in the sky. Meteors come crashing down. And of course there are the eclipses, where the moon goes dark in the middle of the night, or the sun goes dark in the middle of the day. Once these two sets of signs happen in sequence, it's a clear sign to the Chinese people that the heavens may approve if they overthrow the government. The early Zhou kings are going to do everything they can to try to earn the support of Tianming. They plant vegetation along rivers to try to stop erosion. They build dams along rivers to try to control flooding. And as I mentioned earlier with Zhou Wen, they establish granaries, rice storage facilities in the major cities, and they distribute grain in times of famine. They do not want the people rising up against them.